It had rained for 5 straight days in Willow Creek, the kind of rain that blurred the hills and pulled the smell of wet earth into every breath. From my shop window, I could see the river inching higher, pressing against its banks like a restless thing. Folks here said you could tell a lot about the year ahead by the way the river behaved in March. I didn't believe in omens, not anymore. The chime above the antique store door rattled when the wind caught it. Most days that sound was followed by the slow shuffle of one of my regulars, Mrs. Boone looking for glassware or Jimmy Weaver trying to haggle me down on farm tools that weren't for sale. But that afternoon, when I turned toward the door, it wasn't a regular. Daniel Rourke stood there, dripping rain onto the doormat. 8 years. That's how long it had been since I'd last seen him. And still, my chest tightened the way it had that summer night when we'd stood too close under the flickering porch light. The years hadn't stripped that memory from me, no matter how hard I'd tried. He took off his cap, brushed rain from his hair, and looked at me like a man searching for something he wasn't sure he'd recognize anymore. "Ellie," he said, quiet, almost careful. The first time I'd ever seen Daniel, he was 19, working in his father's yard splitting logs. That was before I was Mrs. Carver, before I learned that wanting something could burn you hollow from the inside out. He'd been a boy then, all sharp angles and restless energy. Now he was a man, broad-shouldered, older in the eyes, but something in his gaze still carried that same edge, like he was holding on to a truth that might cut him if he said it aloud. "What brings you back?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Work," he said, "and other things." The pause between those 2 words wasn't long, but it was enough to remind me of the last night we'd spoken, enough to make me want to look away and keep looking at the same time. Outside, the rain tapped harder against the glass, blurring the river into a silver sheet. Inside, the shop smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I busied myself with a box of old books, pretending not to watch him wander the aisles. He paused at a shelf where I kept framed photographs, sepia-toned strangers whose names and stories were long gone. "You still collect these?" he asked. "I collect what no one else wants," I said. His smile was faint. "Guess I qualify then." That line, half joke, half truth, hung in the air. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, low and steady. Martha Carver came in just before closing, shaking the rain from her umbrella and eyeing Daniel like she was measuring him for trouble. "Well," she said, "if it isn't Caleb Rourke's boy. Heard you'd blown back into town." Daniel greeted her politely, but I saw the flicker in his jaw when she mentioned his father. Everyone in Willow Creek knew there was bad blood there, though no one seemed to know the whole of it. Martha didn't linger. She never did when Daniel was around. After she left, the shop felt heavier somehow, the quiet pressing in. When I locked up for the night, the rain had slowed, but the river had risen another foot. Daniel walked me to my car without asking, his boots splashing in the puddles. "You ever think about that night?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I stopped. The question was a match to dry tinder, and for a moment I could almost feel the heat of it again. The way his hand had brushed mine, the way we'd both stepped over a line neither of us had drawn. "Yes," I said. Then, because I couldn't bear the weight of the truth hanging there alone, I added, "But thinking doesn't change anything." Daniel's eyes searched mine, as if he wanted to argue but knew better. He stepped back, gave a nod, and turned toward the shadows. And just like that, the rain began again. By morning, the rain had turned to a thin mist that clung to the glass and made the hills look like they were fading away. The town was quiet, too quiet for a Thursday, but that was Willow Creek in the wet months. Folks stayed inside unless they had business worth braving the damp. I unlocked the shop at 9 sharp like always. Routine was my anchor. Routine kept my hands busy when my mind wanted to drift to places it shouldn't. I told myself Daniel's visit the day before was just coincidence. A man comes home, he runs into old acquaintances, that's all. But that night I'd heard the floorboards creak upstairs. The ones in the room I hadn't set foot in for years. I'd told myself it was the wind, but I didn't sleep after that. The first customer of the day was Mrs. Boone. She always brought me gossip disguised as small talk. "See the river this morning?" she asked while running her fingers over a tray of mismatched buttons. "They're saying we'll have to sandbag by Saturday if it don't let up." I nodded. In Willow Creek, flooding wasn't disaster, it was ritual, but I could tell from the way she lingered on the word they that she meant someone specific. "Daniel Rourke's been helping down by the mill," she added, voice dipping. "Man's been gone near a decade, and now he's the first one down there, sleeves rolled up." I didn't ask how she knew. In this town, news traveled faster than the river, and I pretended not to hear the unspoken part, and you were the first place he showed up. By noon, the mist had thickened into drizzle. I stepped out back to dump the trash, and that's when I saw him, across the alley, leaning against a stack of lumber behind the hardware store. He was talking to someone I didn't recognize, a tall man with a cigarette tucked between two fingers and the kind of posture that said trouble didn't bother him much. They stopped talking when they saw me. The stranger gave me a slow nod, then walked off toward the mill. Daniel stayed where he was. "Need something?" I asked. "Just passing through," he said. But his eyes didn't match his words. They held the same question they had the night before, unasked but loud enough to hear if you knew how to listen. I closed early, not for the weather, but because my thoughts wouldn't settle. At home, the house felt colder than usual. I lit the old oil lamp in the kitchen, even though the power was fine. The soft glow was easier to sit with than the harsh hum of overhead lights. The phone rang just after 6. No one called my landline unless it was something they didn't want to put in writing. "Ellie Carver?" a man's voice asked. Not one I recognized. "You might want to keep your doors locked tonight." The line went dead before I could answer. That night I heard the floorboards again. Upstairs, 3 slow steps, and then silence. I sat in the dark, lamp turned low, listening for the next sound. When it came, it wasn't from upstairs at all. It was outside. 2 knocks on the side door, quiet but deliberate. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "You shouldn't be out here," I whispered. "I heard something," he said. "Figured I'd check on you." We stood in the doorway, the space between us too small, the air too heavy. And somewhere between the sound of the rain and the feel of his eyes on me, I realized something I hadn't let myself think in years. Whatever had started that summer night hadn't ended. It had just been waiting. The next morning, the rain was gone, but the clouds hung low, heavy with the promise it would be back. The river had spread past its banks overnight, swallowing the grass along the edges and creeping toward the road. In Willow Creek, water was like memory. It seeped in slowly, found the cracks you didn't know were there, and stayed long after you thought you'd dried it out. I didn't see Daniel until late that afternoon. I was sweeping the shop's front step when his truck pulled up, an old Ford with a dent in the driver's door and mud caked up the sides. "Mind if I come in?" he asked from the doorway. I stepped aside. He didn't browse this time. He went straight to the counter, rested his hands on the worn wood, and looked at me like a man about to say something he'd been turning over for a long while. "There's something you should know," he started, but before he could finish, the bell over the door rang again. Caleb Rourke walked in. I hadn't seen Caleb in years, and he looked smaller now, like the mines had carved something out of him he never got back. But his eyes, those stayed sharp. They flicked to me, then to Daniel. "Didn't take you long," he said to his son, his voice flat. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not here for a fight." Could have fooled me. Caleb leaned on the counter close enough that I could smell the coal dust still clinging to his jacket. "You ought to know," he said to me. "Folks don't change just because they've been gone a while." The words hung there like smoke. Then he turned and walked out, the bell jangling in his wake. Daniel didn't move. His hands were still on the counter, knuckles pale. "I left because of him," he said finally, "and I came back because I couldn't stay gone." He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. That evening, I drove home slow, watching the swollen river from the bend in the road. Something was caught in the current, a piece of driftwood maybe, but it moved like it had a shape, a weight. As it came closer, I saw it wasn't wood at all. It was a jacket, the kind you'd wear if you worked at the sawmill. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, but when the phone rang again that night, same number, same pause before the voice, it was harder to pretend it wasn't connected. "Keep your doors locked," the man said again. Only this time, he added, "and stay away from the Rourke boy." Before I could speak, the line went dead. I locked every door and window, turned off the lights, and sat in the kitchen with the oil lamp lit low. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Then, faintly at first, I heard it, the sound of water dripping, not from the sink but from somewhere deeper in the house. I followed it, step by step, until I reached the back hall. The door to the cellar stood open. The smell hit me before I even stepped inside. Wet earth, mildew, and something else, sharp and metallic. I should have turned back, but I went down, one slow step at a time. At the bottom, in the dim light, something moved. Daniel stepped out from the shadows. "I told you to lock your doors," he said, his voice low. "But you didn't tell me you'd be inside them," I replied. His eyes held mine for a long moment before he said, "Ellie, you need to hear the whole story before you decide what to believe about me." He didn't move from the shadow of the cellar wall. The lamp I held sent his face into half light, the other half swallowed by darkness. It was the kind of scene that made you wonder whether you were talking to the man you remembered or to someone entirely new. "I left Willow Creek because of my father," Daniel began, voice low. "But you know that already." I did, or I thought I did. "What you don't know," he continued, "is that I came back because of you." The words landed like stones in still water. No splash, just a deep ripple that spread through me. I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to ask why now, after all these years. But before I could, he shook his head. "There's more," he said. "But if I tell it all at once, you won't believe me." We sat in the kitchen after that, the lamp between us. He told me pieces, never the whole. How his father had done business with the wrong kind of people. How debts didn't just disappear, even when the man who owed them was too old to pay. "Caleb owed them more than money," Daniel said, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "He owed them loyalty, and when he couldn't give it, they came looking for something else. Someone else." "You?" I asked. His silence was answer enough. The knock at the door came just before midnight. 3 sharp raps, not the hesitant kind you get from a neighbor. Daniel tensed. He motioned for me to stay put and moved toward the door. From the kitchen, I heard the hinges creak, then a man's voice. "You've been hard to find, Rourke." Daniel stepped outside, closing the door behind him. I didn't mean to listen, but the night was quiet enough that their voices carried. "You got what you came for?" Daniel asked. "Not yet," the man replied. "But we will, and you'd better hope the lady inside doesn't make it harder for you than it already is." Footsteps, then silence. When Daniel came back in, his jaw was set, eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "They won't stop," he said simply. "Not until they take what they think they're owed." I didn't sleep that night, not because of the men outside or the open cellar door or even the phone calls, but because of the way Daniel had said you when he talked about why he came back. The next day, word spread fast. Someone from the mill hadn't come home. That jacket I'd seen in the river, maybe it hadn't been just a piece of debris after all. Mrs. Boone was in the shop early, pretending to browse while she fed me half-whispered rumors. "They say he was last seen talking to your friend," she said, eyes glinting with the kind of curiosity that can cut deep. "My friend?" I asked. "You know who I mean, Rourke." That night I locked the doors before dark. But just after 11, I saw movement on the porch, not Daniel. A figure stood at the edge of the light, tall, still, waiting. When I stepped closer to the glass, the figure leaned forward just enough for me to see the curve of a smile. Then he tapped 2 fingers against the window, slow and deliberate, before disappearing into the dark. When I turned, Daniel was at the top of the stairs watching me. "They're not warning you anymore," he said. "They're claiming you." I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I went to the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of water, and set them on the table between us like we were having an ordinary conversation. Daniel didn't sit. He stayed at the edge of the lamplight, eyes fixed on me. "You said they're claiming me," I finally said. "Why? What could I possibly have to do with this?" His gaze didn't waver. "Because they think I'll give them anything to keep you out of it." I wanted to tell him it wasn't his job to protect me, but the truth was, this had never been just his fight. Not since that night years ago. It was the summer after my husband died. The air was thick and hot, the kind that pressed against your skin. I'd been living in the old house less than 6 months, still unpacking boxes when the power went out. I remember standing on the porch with a flashlight, watching the heat lightning in the distance. That's when I saw him, 19 years old, walking down the dirt road toward me like he'd been sent there by some invisible hand. "Lights out all over," he'd said, stopping at the steps. "Want company till it comes back?" I should have said no. I should have remembered that a woman alone in a small town doesn't need to invite questions. But I was lonely in a way that felt like drowning, and he was the first person in months who looked at me like I wasn't made of glass. We'd sat on the porch talking about nothing and everything, how the river always looked different at night, how the stars seemed closer in the summer heat. Then the storm rolled in. The rain came sudden and hard, forcing us inside. I'd meant to light candles, but I never made it past the kitchen. One minute, we were laughing about something. I can't even remember what now. The next, he was close enough that I could see the raindrops clinging to his eyelashes. And then, it was the kind of kiss that doesn't fade with time, no matter how many years you stack on top of it. The kind you remember in your bones. We didn't talk about it after. Not then, not ever. The next day, he was gone. Back in the present, Daniel sat down at last, elbows on the table. "I left because I didn't want to drag you into my mess," he said. "But I never stopped thinking about that night. And now, I think they know." I stared at him, my pulse loud in my ears. "Know what?" I asked. "That you're the one thing I'd come back for." The phone rang. We both froze, listening to the sound cut through the quiet. Daniel reached for it before I could, pressed it to his ear, and didn't speak. After a long pause, he hung up and said, "They've got someone." "Who?" "Someone from the mill, and they want to trade." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain again. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes shadowed. "They think I'll bring them something worth more than a life," he said. "And if they can't get it from me, they'll take you." By morning, the air was heavy and still, the kind that feels like it's waiting for something to break. I opened the shop as usual, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Daniel had left before sunrise, saying only that he had to check on something at the mill. The street outside was quieter than it should have been for a Friday. The few people who passed didn't meet my eyes, like they knew something I didn't, or maybe didn't want me to know. Around 10, a black sedan pulled up across the street. Not a local car. Too polished, too quiet. 2 men got out. They didn't come in right away. They stood on the curb talking, one lighting a cigarette while the other scanned the street like he was counting exits. When they finally crossed over, the bell above the door sounded sharper than usual. "Ellie Carver?" the taller one asked. "Yes," I said, though my voice didn't sound like mine. "We're looking for Daniel Rourke." "Why?" The shorter man smiled without humor. "Because he owes us. And you know what happens when a man doesn't pay his debts." I kept my hands on the counter so they wouldn't see the tremor in them. "I don't know where he is," I said. "That's fine," the tall one replied. "We'll wait." They didn't leave. They lingered in the shop, touching nothing, speaking to each other in low voices. Customers who came in turned right back around. I tried to act busy, but every time I looked up, one of them was watching me, not the casual kind of watching, measuring. After nearly an hour, the taller one stepped close enough that I could smell the smoke on his jacket. "Tell him we stopped by," he said, then leaning in so only I could hear, "and tell him next time we won't be this polite." They walked out together, got in the sedan, and drove off slow enough for me to see the plates weren't local. Daniel came back around noon. I told him everything, the car, the men, what they'd said. "They're not supposed to come near you," he muttered, pacing. "Supposed to?" I asked. He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "They've got rules, lines they don't usually cross. If they're crossing them now, it means they're done negotiating." We closed the shop early. Daniel didn't ask. He just locked the door and told me to grab what I needed for the night. We drove out past the edge of town where the old service road wound up into the hills. At the top was a hunting cabin that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Daniel unlocked the door without explaining how he had the key. "It's not much," he said, "but they won't find you here." I stepped inside. It smelled of cedar and dust, the air cool and still. The windows looked out over the river, swollen and restless. "Why are they after you?" I asked. "Really?" Daniel leaned against the wall, eyes on the water. "Because I walked away from something they think I still owe them, and because I left with something they think belongs to them." Outside, the wind shifted and the trees began to whisper. I didn't know if it was the storm coming in or the feeling that we'd just stepped past a line we couldn't walk back from. The morning after the diner parking lot incident, the town seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. Winter light filtered weakly through a layer of thin cloud, washing everything in a pale, indifferent glow. Clara's truck sat in her driveway, its front fender still showing the faint dent from where she'd nudged a fence post weeks ago. She stood at her kitchen window with a chipped coffee mug in hand, staring at it like the metal itself might give her answers. She hadn't spoken to Michael since the night before. Not about what he'd seen in her eyes when their conversation turned toward the past. Not about why he'd avoided walking her to her truck, hands jammed deep in his coat pockets, as if afraid they might betray him. Her phone buzzed against the counter. A text from Evelyn. "You're coming tonight, right? Can't keep hiding." Clara didn't answer. She didn't have the heart for the gathering Evelyn meant. Too many faces, too many chances for the wrong word to fall into the wrong ear. Instead, she drove out past the mill, down the gravel road that wound along the river. The water was running higher now, fed by the melting snow upstream. On a wide bend, she pulled over and shut off the engine. She used to come here with Michael when they were young, back when the river felt like their secret. They'd skip stones, talk about leaving this place, and sometimes just sit in silence, the current doing all the speaking they needed. Today, the silence was different. It had edges. Her mind kept circling back to the photograph Michael had mentioned once, the one that proved he'd been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be that night years ago. He'd never shown it to her, but she'd always suspected it had something to do with the fire. A knock on her driver's side window startled her. Michael stood there, hat pulled low, hands red from the cold. She rolled the window down a crack. "You following me now?" she asked, trying for lightness, failing. "Guess I am," he said. His voice was rough, not from the weather, but from something he hadn't said yet. They walked down to the riverbank together, boots crunching over frost-stiff grass. "Evelyn says you're avoiding everyone," he said. "Maybe I am." "Why?" She looked out over the water. "Because it's easier than answering questions I don't have answers to." He studied her for a long moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope. He held it out like it weighed more than it should. "This is the photo," he said. She didn't take it right away. Her breath fogged the air between them. "You sure you want me to see it?" "I'm not sure about anything anymore," he said. But it's yours now." The envelope felt warm from his pocket. She didn't open it. Not yet. The river kept moving, uncaring, carrying secrets downstream. Behind them, the sound of a car engine started up on the road. Clara turned just enough to see a dark sedan idling, watching. She didn't recognize the driver, and that, more than anything, made her feel exposed. Michael followed her gaze. "We're not alone anymore," he murmured, and for the first time in years, Clara realized just how much danger might still be trailing them. The dark sedan lingered longer than it should have. Clara could feel the driver's eyes tracking her, though the tinted glass made it impossible to be sure. When it finally rolled away, gravel crunching under its tires, the quiet that followed didn't feel like relief. It felt like a pause in something larger. Michael didn't say anything, but his jaw was tight, his gaze still fixed on the empty road. "You know them?" Clara asked. "No." His voice was too flat to be comforting. They walked back to her truck in silence. She sat in the driver's seat with the envelope still in her hands, its paper soft and worn, the flap creased like it had been opened too many times. Michael leaned against the side of the truck, arms folded, watching her. "Go on," he said quietly. She slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a single photograph. It wasn't glossy anymore. Time had dulled the surface, leaving tiny white scratches where the image had worn. It was a night shot, lit only by the harsh cone of a street lamp. In the background, the shell of the old hardware store, its windows dark and its sign hanging half loose from rusted bolts. In the foreground, a man half turned toward the camera, his face caught in mid-expression, mouth open like he'd just heard something. It was Michael, younger but unmistakably him, and behind him, blurred but visible, was the start of a fire, its orange light licking up into the frame. Her throat felt dry. This is from that night?" Michael didn't answer right away. His eyes were somewhere far away, locked on a memory he couldn't shake. "Someone left it in my mailbox the morning after. No note, no explanation." "Why didn't you tell anyone? Because it makes me look guilty, and because maybe I am." The last words hit harder than the photograph itself. "You didn't start that fire, Michael," Clara said, but her voice wavered. She wanted to believe it, needed to, but the image was too sharp, too damning. He gave a humorless half-smile. "You're the only one who ever thought that." A wind came up off the river, colder now, sharper. Clara tucked the photo back into the envelope, but the image had already burned itself into her mind. Michael stepped back from the truck, glancing over his shoulder at the road. "If that car comes back, you call me. No hesitation." She nodded, though she knew if the sedan returned, it might already be too late for calls. When she drove home, the envelope rode shotgun, its presence heavy as stone. She left it on the kitchen table but found herself staring at it every time she passed, like it might move on its own. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the glow of the fire, Michael's face half lit, and the knowledge that someone, maybe the same someone in the sedan, still cared enough to watch them all these years later. By morning, she realized the photograph wasn't the only message. It was a warning. The rain returned that afternoon, soft at first, then relentless. Clara sat at her kitchen table with the envelope in front of her, the same photograph lying on top. She'd told herself she wouldn't keep staring at it, that she'd put it away somewhere safe. But the truth was she didn't trust it to be out of sight, not when someone might come for it. She traced the edges with her fingertip, eyes fixed on the background of the image. The hardware store was easy to recognize, but what caught her now was a shadow just past the street lamp. A shape, too far away to make out details, but big enough to be a person. Watching. She stood abruptly, grabbed her coat, and left. The old hardware store was only 10 minutes away if she took the back road. The rain slicked the asphalt, turning puddles into small mirrors. She kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting the dark sedan to materialize again. It didn't, but that somehow made her more uneasy. When she pulled up, the place looked even worse than in the photograph. The roof sagged, and the front window had caved in completely. She stepped inside, her boots crunching over damp debris. In the far corner, a blackened patch of floor still showed where the fire had burned hottest. She crouched, running her hand lightly over the charred wood, and imagined the heat, the smell, the sound of it collapsing. A voice behind her broke the silence. "Didn't think you'd come here alone." She turned sharply. Michael stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hair and jacket. "I needed to see it," she said. "In the photo, there's someone here, not you, behind you. Do you remember?" He stepped closer, scanning the same spot she'd been looking at. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders tensed. "I remember hearing something," he admitted. "Footsteps, maybe, but when I turned, no one was there." Clara swallowed. What if that person started the fire? What if the photo was meant to keep you quiet? Michael's gaze slid toward the street outside. "Then they're still out there, and they still want me to take the blame." The sound of an engine cut through the rain, low, steady, approaching. Clara's pulse jumped, Michael's eyes narrowed. Through the gap in the window, a familiar black sedan rolled slowly past, tires hissing on wet pavement. It didn't stop, didn't speed up, just passed like it knew exactly who was inside and didn't need to hurry. Michael moved toward the doorway, but Clara caught his arm. "They want you to follow," she whispered. He met her eyes, unreadable for a long moment, then stepped back. "Then we make them think I will." Outside, the sedan turned the corner and vanished into the curtain of rain. The rain didn't let up as they left the hardware store. Clara drove, her fingers tight on the wheel, Michael in the passenger seat, scanning every passing car. They didn't talk. At the next intersection, she spotted the black sedan's taillights 2 blocks ahead, slipping through a yellow light. "They're heading toward Bramble Road," Michael murmured, almost to himself. Clara's stomach turned. "What's there?" He didn't answer at first, then said, "A place I used to know before the fire." She didn't push. They kept their distance, slowing whenever the sedan slowed. It finally turned onto a narrow, tree-lined lane where the streetlights barely reached through the heavy branches. Bramble Road was a place she'd only heard about. Old houses tucked away from view, some abandoned, others looking like they should be. When the sedan pulled into a cracked driveway beside a sagging 2-story house, its lights flicked off instantly. Clara parked 1 block away. The rain on the windshield became white noise, amplifying the tension between them. Michael unbuckled his seatbelt. "Wait here." "No," she said too quickly. "If you're going, I'm going." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. They moved silently along the sidewalk until they reached the driveway. The house loomed above them, its windows dark except for a faint light leaking from the back. They circled around, staying close to the overgrown shrubs. Through a gap, Clara saw 2 figures inside, one standing, one sitting. The standing figure was a woman with hair pulled into a tight braid. The sitting figure, Clara couldn't see clearly, but Michael's entire body went rigid when he looked. She turned to him. "Who is that?" He shook his head, but not like he didn't know, more like he didn't want to say. Before she could press him, the woman with the braid glanced toward the back window. Her eyes seemed to pierce the darkness. Michael grabbed Clara's hand. "We need to go. Now." They didn't run until they reached the corner. When they did, Clara's pulse was hammering. "Michael, what was that? Who was she? And who was that man?" Michael's voice was low, but it carried a weight she'd never heard before. That man shouldn't be alive. They drove without speaking, the wipers ticking back and forth like a clock, counting down to something inevitable. Clara could still see the faint outline of the man's face in that dimly lit kitchen. Not enough detail, but enough to feel wrong. Michael hadn't looked away from the road once since they left Bramble Road. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "Michael, You said he shouldn't be alive. What does that mean? His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Because I saw him die. She stared at him. You're serious? He nodded once, eyes locked forward. 3 years ago, there was a fire. That man, his name's Owen Mercer, was trapped inside. I pulled 2 people out before the beams came down. He wasn't one of them. Clara's thoughts scrambled for purchase. So if he's alive, it means someone lied, or someone wanted me to believe he was gone. The car slowed as they reached the old gas station near the outskirts of town. Michael pulled in, cutting the engine but leaving the headlights on. Rain streaked down the windshield, blurring the edges of reality. I need you to understand something, Clara, he said, voice low. Owen Mercer wasn't just some guy. He worked for my father before everything went to hell, and if he's here now in that house, it's not by accident. Her pulse quickened. And the woman with him? Michael hesitated, then said, Her name's Evelyn. She used to be close to me, closer than anyone. But she chose Owen's side after the fire. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. This wasn't just about a mysterious sedan anymore. It was about people Michael had once trusted, people who were supposed to be gone. She leaned back, staring out at the rain. So what do we do now? Michael looked at her then, his eyes hard but edged with something else. Regret, maybe. We find out why they're back, and if they're here for me, or for you. The storm hadn't let up by the time Michael pulled the truck to the edge of Bramble Road again. The houses looked the same as they had hours earlier, dim, half asleep, holding their secrets behind warped siding and drawn curtains. Clara's heartbeat was loud in her ears. They'd parked far enough that the truck's engine wouldn't be heard. The rest they covered on foot. Water splashed at their ankles as they cut across the overgrown lawn toward the yellow house, the one with the kitchen light still glowing. Inside, Owen was at the table, a glass in his hand, head tilted like he'd been expecting company. Evelyn sat opposite him, her eyes flicking to the window before Clara even reached it. Michael pushed the door open without knocking. Owen's smile was slow. Well, took you long enough. Michael stepped inside, rain dripping from his jacket onto the warped floorboards. I thought you were dead. Guess you were wrong, Owen said easily. Not the first time. Clara hovered near the doorway, taking in Evelyn. She was striking, but not in the way beauty normally announced itself. There was something sharpened about her, as if she'd learned to be dangerous just to survive. You've been watching us, Clara said. Evelyn didn't deny it. And what have you learned? That you're both here for something, Michael cut in. And I want to know if it's me or her. The silence stretched, broken only by the rain against the windows. Then Owen said, It's not that simple. Make it simple, Michael snapped. Evelyn's gaze moved to Clara. Do you know who your father is? The question landed like a stone in her chest. My father died before I was born. Evelyn's lips curved, almost sadly. That's what they told you. Michael took a step forward. Don't. But it was too late. The look in Owen's eyes said they'd already decided to tell her, or maybe to use the truth as a weapon. Clara felt the room tilt, the edges of everything going soft. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and endless, as if it had been waiting years for this night. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the smell of it still clung to the air, heavy and metallic, like the world hadn't quite decided to dry out. The streets were slick, shining faintly under the lone yellow streetlight outside Eli's shop. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigeration unit in the gas station across the road, the quiet creak of the sign swinging in the breeze. Everything else was still, too still. I sat in my truck for a long time before getting out, watching the familiar silhouette of Eli leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, his face half lit, half in shadow. There was a cigarette in his hand, but he wasn't smoking it, just letting it burn. When I finally stepped out, the gravel crunched too loudly under my boots. My throat felt tight. I'd told myself I was here just to talk, but we both knew that was a lie I'd been carrying since the day we ran into each other again. He didn't move when I reached him, just looked at me with that steady, unreadable gaze of his, the same one he'd given me years ago in that dark stretch of forest, the night everything between us had shifted without either of us being ready. "You didn't call," he said quietly, not angry, not accusing, just a fact. "I couldn't," I replied, and I hated how small my voice sounded. His jaw flexed slightly, like he was holding back something. "Can't or won't?" I wanted to say something sharp back, but instead I just looked away, down at the ground. The puddles caught the streetlight in fractured pieces, and I thought about how easy it was for something whole to look broken if you caught it from the wrong angle. He took a step closer, and the space between us seemed to shrink to nothing. The air felt charged, humming with things we'd never said. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from knowing there were no more safe places to hide in this conversation. "Claire?" He said my name like it was both a question and a warning. I met his eyes then, and for a heartbeat, we were back in that forest. The rain in our hair, our breaths tangled, that one reckless choice that had haunted us ever since. Only this time there was no darkness to hide in, just the soft hum of a small town night and the truth pressing between us like a pulse. The night stretched thin between us, every second weighted by things left unsaid. Eli's eyes searched mine like he was looking for a hidden answer, or maybe for a reason to let go of the past. I never stopped thinking about that night, I finally admitted, voice barely above a whisper. The way we fell apart, the choices we made, and the ones we didn't make. He shook his head slowly, a ghost of a smile flickering. "You think it's just about that night. It's never been just that, Claire. It's everything after." I swallowed hard, feeling the words I'd kept locked away breaking free. The silence, the distance, the lies we told ourselves to survive. He stepped closer, the cigarette now forgotten between his fingers. We were young, reckless, and maybe scared, but I was alone, Eli. Not alone, never alone. For a moment, the world outside faded. The streetlights, the distant hum of the town, even the cold air, all replaced by the fragile space between us. "I'm scared," I confessed. "That we can't fix what's broken?" "No, that we never knew what was real to begin with." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. A light touch, electric in its simplicity. "We don't have to have all the answers tonight, but what then?" He smiled, sad and knowing. "Then we keep trying, one day at a time. The past wasn't something we could change, but maybe the future, fragile and uncertain, was still ours to write." The dawn was soft, pale light filtering through the curtains like a tentative promise. Outside, the town was waking slowly. The distant clatter of a train, the low murmur of early voices, the scent of fresh coffee drifting from somewhere down the street. I sat on the porch steps, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, watching the world come alive again. Eli was beside me, his presence steady and calm, no words needed to fill the space between us. We didn't speak of the past anymore, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer had the power to hurt us. The scars were still there beneath the surface, but so was something new, a fragile hope, like the first green shoots after winter's thaw. "Where do we go from here?" I asked, voice soft. He looked at me, eyes clear in the morning light. "Forward," he said simply, "always forward." And sometimes that was all you could ask for, a chance to start again, a quiet day after the storm.